The first time I heard about the locked wing, it wasn't from a news report or a leaked document. It was a voice note sent at 2:13 a.m., shaky and rushed, like the person speaking was afraid of being overheard. The message was only 20 seconds long, but it ended with a sentence I couldn't forget. If I don't come back, tell people it wasn't a disease. It was the wing. At the time, I didn't even know what wing they were talking about. I assumed it was a hospital rumor, the kind doctors whisper about during night shifts to scare interns. But the name kept appearing in places it shouldn't have. Buried comments under deleted articles, anonymous posts on medical forums, redacted lines in public health reports. Always the same phrase. The locked wing of who? And always the same warning. No one returns. Officially, the World Health Organization doesn't have wings the way hospitals do. It has offices, research units, secured floors. Clean words. Safe words. But people who work there long enough don't use those terms. They call it the wing because once you're inside, time bends. Days don't move forward the way they should. And when someone enters, the building records don't always show them leaving. The story usually starts the same way. A transfer. A reassignment. A sudden promotion that makes no sense. Someone mid-career competent but not famous, quietly moved to a restricted division for a few weeks. They tell their family it's confidential. They stop posting online. Their phone goes to voicemail. And when colleagues ask where they went, they're told not to ask again. I didn't believe any of this at first. I've spent years around medical stories, outbreak investigations, emergency responses. I know how fear spreads faster than facts. But what bothered me wasn't the rumors. It was the paperwork. Because paperwork doesn't lie easily. There were expense reports approved for people who no longer existed in staff directories. Access badges logged entry into a secured corridor with no matching exit scans. Emails sent from official who addresses weeks after their owners were declared on extended leave. And then there were the death certificates. Not deaths, exactly, administrative closures. Names sealed, causes listed as non-reportable. That's when I realized something was being hidden, not from the public, but from the system itself. The locked wing isn't marked on any map. If you walk through headquarters, it doesn't appear on floor plans. Elevators skip its level. Staircases reroute. Even security guards avoid talking about it. They'll tell you cameras don't work properly near that corridor. They'll joke that phones lose signal. Then they'll change the subject. One former contractor told me he'd been inside once, just past the threshold. He said the air felt heavier, like the building was holding its breath. The lights weren't fluorescent or warm, just white enough to hurt your eyes. And the doors, every door, locked automatically behind you, even the ones that shouldn't. He lasted 11 minutes before an alarm sounded and 2 men in plain clothes escorted him out. His badge was deactivated before he reached the lobby. He was paid double his contract and told never to mention what he'd seen. When I asked him what he saw, he went quiet. Then he said something that still chills me. I didn't see patients, he said. I saw results. What kind of results require people to disappear? The official purpose of the wing, according to the few sanitized lines I could find, was high-risk containment research. But containment of what? There were no outbreak alerts tied to the dates people entered. No emergency declarations. No global briefings. Whatever was inside wasn't spreading. Or maybe it already had. One name kept coming back to me as I dug deeper. Dr. Elias Werner, epidemiologist. Specialist in emerging pathogens. Clean record. No scandals. He entered the locked wing on a Monday morning with a coffee in his hand and a smile caught on a security camera. By Friday, his office was cleared out. By Sunday, his name was removed from internal directories. His family was told he'd accepted a long-term international assignment. They never heard from him again. But his phone did. 3 months later, at exactly 3:07 a.m., his wife received a missed call from his number. No voicemail. No follow-up. When she called back, the number was inactive. Telecom records showed the call originated from inside WHO headquarters. That shouldn't be possible. As I followed the trail, I learned that everyone who entered the locked wing was selected for the same reason. Not because they were expendable, but because they were irreplaceable. People whose knowledge couldn't easily be replicated. People who knew how systems failed under pressure. People who could recognize patterns others missed. And maybe that's why none of them were allowed to leave. The more I uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. The locked wing wasn't responding to a crisis. It was preparing for one. Something anticipated, modeled, simulated beyond ethical limits. Something that required human observation, not just machines. Something that couldn't risk leaks. I reached out to a former administrator who'd retired quietly 5 years ago. At first, he refused to speak. Then I sent him a single question. How many exit badges exist for the locked wing? He replied an hour later with 2 words. Fewer now. That was the moment I realized the danger wasn't just inside the wing. It was in knowing too much about it. Because every source I contacted started behaving the same way after talking to me. Delayed replies. Short messages. Sudden cancellations. One blocked me entirely and later sent a single line from a new account. Please stop. They monitor interest. Monitor interest in what? Diseases don't monitor curiosity. Organizations do. The last piece came unexpectedly. An unmarked envelope slid under my door one evening. No return address, no fingerprints. Inside was a printed access log, dated just 2 days earlier. One entry stood out. A new name, a temporary ID, and next to it, a note scribbled in pen. First return attempt. That was it. No explanation. No context. If no one returns from the locked wing, then why would anyone try? And more importantly, what happens when something inside decides it wants to leave? The words first return attempt stayed with me longer than I expected. They weren't dramatic, not emotional, just factual, like a lab note written by someone who didn't have time to explain. I read them again and again, wondering who had written them and why they thought I should see it. Whoever sent that envelope knew I was already looking. That meant I wasn't alone in this anymore, and that thought was more unsettling than comforting. I started digging into past records, not official reports, but the spaces between them. Archived conference schedules, old keynote panels, workshops that were announced, and then quietly canceled. Each cancellation lined up with the same thing, a speaker who had recently been reassigned within the World Health Organization. Their biographies still existed online, but the update stopped. No new publications. No public appearances. Almost like their careers had been frozen in time. What connected them all was a shared language. Not spoken words, but patterns in their work. They studied rare outbreaks, unexplained recoveries, anomalies in transmission models. The kinds of cases that don't fit clean graphs. The kinds of data that make institutions nervous because they raise questions no one is ready to answer. I spoke to a junior analyst who had worked 2 floors below the restricted area. She asked me not to use her name, and I understood why the moment I heard her voice. She sounded tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. She told me that late at night, when the building was quiet, the ventilation system near the locked wing changed tone. A low hum, like machinery running under strain. It wasn't constant. It reacted. When someone entered the corridor, the sound deepened, almost like a response. She never went near the wing, but she saw who did. People escorted without conversation. No lab coats. No visible equipment. Just folders and secure tablets. And sometimes, she said, they came back different. Not from the wing. No one came back from the wing, but from meetings about it. Their eyes wouldn't settle. Their questions shifted from how to treat disease to how to manage information. One night, she stayed late to finish a report. Around midnight, she noticed lights flickering on a floor that wasn't supposed to exist. The building directory skipped that level entirely, but there it was, glowing faintly behind frosted glass. She felt a pull to look closer. Then a sudden wave of fear, so sharp she shut down her computer and left without her bag. The next morning, security had reviewed the footage and reminded staff about restricted curiosity. That phrase appears nowhere in WHO policy, but several people mentioned it independently, like a warning passed from mouth to mouth. The locked wing, as far as I could tell, came into existence quietly after a global health scare that never made headlines. An incident officially classified as a contained irregularity. No press conference. No public data. Just a sudden spike in internal security budgets and the construction of a corridor that didn't exist before. What troubled me most was how the language around the wing evolved. Early documents spoke about containment and observation. Later ones used words like persistence, resistance, and adaptation. Not in the way you describe a virus, but in the way you describe behavior. I asked a retired lab technician what he thought was being studied there. He stared at his hands for a long time before answering. Not a disease, he said. A reaction. A reaction to what, he wouldn't say. As the days passed, I noticed something else. My own digital trail was changing. Articles I'd bookmarked vanished. Messages I'd sent went unread, then disappeared. A colleague texted me asking why I'd tried to access a restricted database I'd never heard of. When I told him I hadn't, he didn't reply. It felt like the story was watching back. The phrase "no one return" started to sound less like a warning and more like a rule. Not because leaving was impossible, but because returning with knowledge was unacceptable. Whatever the locked wing held, it wasn't just dangerous. It was destabilizing. Something that challenged how global health, safety, and control were supposed to work. Late one evening, I received an email from an address that didn't exist when I tried to reply. The subject line was simple: "You're asking the wrong question." The body contained only one sentence: "The problem isn't why no one returns, it's why they ever went in." Attached was a blurred image of a hallway. White walls. No signage. And, at the far end, a door slightly open, with light spilling out in a way that felt wrong, like it was bending around the frame. In the corner of the image was a timestamp from 2 days in the future. I couldn't tell if it was a threat or an invitation. The more context I gathered, the clearer it became that the locked wing wasn't sealed to protect the world from what was inside. It was sealed to protect the world from understanding it. Because understanding leads to questions, and questions lead to panic. Institutions are built to manage risk, not existential doubt. Somewhere inside that wing, people were observing something that refused to stay in its category. Something that crossed lines between biology, behavior, and awareness. And the people chosen to study it were the ones most capable of realizing what it meant. Which might explain why the first return attempt mattered so much. If someone was trying to come back, it meant the rule had been challenged. And if the rule could be challenged once, it could break. The question was whether that person was trying to escape or whether something else was trying to follow them out. And as I stared at that future timestamp, I realized the countdown had already begun. The idea that something might be trying to leave the locked wing changed how I looked at everything that followed. Before, the mystery felt contained, boxed inside concrete walls and security clearances. Now it felt loose, like a crack running through a dam. I stopped thinking of the wing as a place and started thinking of it as a pressure point. I began tracing the people closest to those who disappeared, not coworkers but family members, friends, anyone who noticed subtle changes before contact was lost. A pattern emerged there too. In the weeks before reassignment, many of them talked about strange requests at work. Not unethical, just odd. Requests to revisit old data sets that had already been closed. To re-examine cases that were labeled solved. To ask questions no one else was asking anymore. One wife told me her husband became obsessed with a single line in a report about an outbreak that burned out on its own. He kept saying that outbreaks don't just stop without a reason. There's always a trace. When she asked him what he thought the reason was, he said, "Something noticed us noticing it." He laughed when he said it, like he knew it sounded ridiculous, but he didn't laugh with his eyes. Another subplot surfaced through internal training material. I found references to psychological resilience workshops mandatory for certain departments. These weren't stress management sessions. They focused on cognitive dissonance, on how to hold two conflicting truths without reacting emotionally. One slide asked, "What do you do when evidence contradicts foundational assumptions?" There was no suggested answer. I talked to a former security consultant who helped design access protocols for high-risk facilities. He explained that the locked wing security wasn't just about keeping people out. It was about controlling narrative flow. Every person who entered signed layered agreements, not just about confidentiality, but about interpretation. They were warned that misreading what they saw could cause harm on a global scale. That's not how you talk about a virus, he said. That's how you talk about information. From another angle, I looked at funding. Budgets don't lie, even when reports do. The locked wing drew money from health, defense, and something labeled continuity planning. That last category usually deals with natural disasters or infrastructure collapse. It didn't make sense for disease research, unless the concern wasn't mortality, but disruption. Around this time, the envelope sender reached out again. This time not anonymously, just an initial. M. The messages were careful, spaced days apart, always short. M claimed to be part of a review committee formed after the first return attempt failed. When I asked what failed meant, M replied, the body returned. The context did not. That sentence opened another door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through. M explained that the locked wing wasn't testing cures or containment strategies. It was observing thresholds, points at which human systems, medical, social, informational, stop behaving predictably. The entity, phenomenon, or reaction inside the wing seemed to exist at those thresholds. Not alive in the traditional sense, but responsive. A mirror that changed based on who looked into it and how. From the perspective of those inside, time didn't behave normally. Days compressed, memory fragmented. People documented observations only to later deny writing them. That's why returning was so dangerous. You couldn't carry the full understanding back with you. It arrived in pieces out of order, often at the wrong time. Meanwhile, outside the wing, subtle things were happening. Global health recommendations shifted language slightly. Words like certainty disappeared, replaced with confidence intervals. Public messaging emphasized calm over clarity. It wasn't obvious unless you were watching closely, but it felt like preparation for misunderstanding on a massive scale. Another angle came from ethics boards. Several members resigned quietly over the years, citing personal reasons. One of them agreed to speak off record. He said the central conflict wasn't whether research should continue, but whether stopping it would make things worse. Once you know something can react to observation, he said, ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just makes it blind. That fear explained the locked wing better than any official statement. They weren't locking something in. They were locking humanity into a role as observer, whether it liked it or not. The subplots began to converge when I learned about a second, undocumented return attempt. This one wasn't physical. It involved data, a package of files transmitted out of the wing using a route no one could trace afterward. The files were incomplete, corrupted, but analysts who saw them described patterns that repeated across unrelated systems, health data, social behavior models, even traffic flows. The implication was unsettling. Whatever was inside the locked wing didn't just affect biology. It touched systems built on human decision-making. As I pieced these perspectives together, the main conflict sharpened. The World Health Organization wasn't hiding a monster or a secret disease. It was caught between two impossible choices: reveal a reality that could destabilize trust in every system people rely on, or contain that reality at the cost of sacrificing those who understood it too well. And then there was the third option, the one no one spoke about directly: adapt. The locked wing might not be a prison or a lab, but a negotiation space. A place where humanity was learning, slowly and painfully, how to coexist with something that emerged once we started mapping ourselves too closely. The tension now wasn't just about who entered or who returned. It was about whether the boundary itself was holding. Because if the first return attempt marked a crack, then every new observer, every new question, widened it. And somewhere behind doors that don't appear on maps, something was learning how we react when we're afraid of what we've discovered. By now, the locked wing felt less like a secret and more like a living fault line. Every new detail added weight, and the ground beneath the story started to shift. I wasn't just uncovering what the World Health Organization was hiding. I was watching how carefully they were holding something back from the rest of the world. And the effort it took to keep that balance was beginning to show cracks. M's messages became more frequent, but also more urgent. Short warnings replaced careful explanations. They know the pattern is spreading. Observation outside the wing is increasing. Containment isn't just physical anymore. Each line suggested the same thing. The main conflict was accelerating faster than anyone planned. What made it worse was that people outside who were starting to feel it without knowing why. Analysts reported sudden shifts in predictive models. Long-standing assumptions in global health planning stopped working overnight. Simulations that had been reliable for decades began producing contradictory outcomes. When teams tried to correct the data, the corrections made things worse. It was as if the systems themselves were reacting to being studied. Inside, emergency meetings were being held under neutral titles. No minutes were shared. No official decisions announced. But insiders told me the debate was reaching a breaking point. One side argued for disclosure, controlled, gradual, framed as an abstract risk. The other side argued that even partial truth would invite uncontrolled observation. Once the public started looking, asking, measuring, there would be no way to stop the feedback loop. And at the center of that argument was the locked wing. Security protocols tightened. Access windows shortened. Even senior officials needed secondary approval to approach the corridor. The building felt different, sources said. Quieter. Like everyone was waiting for something to happen and pretending they weren't. Then came the anomaly that no one could explain away. A biometric scan logged an exit from the locked wing. No name. No badge ID. Just a timestamp and a confirmation tone. The system registered it as valid, even though there was no corresponding entry. It was impossible, yet the log remained. Attempts to delete it failed. Attempts to flag it triggered automated lockdowns. That single data point sent shockwaves through internal channels. If something had exited without being tracked, it meant the assumptions underpinning the wing's security were flawed. Or worse, irrelevant. M sent me one final message that night. If this goes public, it won't be about disease. It will be about trust. And trust collapses faster than any outbreak. I could feel the tension tightening, not just in the story, but around me. Calls dropped mid-sentence. Files took longer to load. Even unrelated conversations seemed to circle the same idea. Uncertainty. People everywhere were sensing it, the way animals sense pressure changes before storm. The first return attempt, the second data breach, the unexplained exit. None of these were isolated anymore. They were steps in a progression. Something was moving closer to the surface, and the locked wing was no longer enough to hold it back. What terrified the decision-makers wasn't the idea of something escaping. It was the realization that it might already be interacting with the world, subtly influencing how humans respond to information, fear, and authority. If that was true, then the conflict wasn't between who and the unknown. It was between humanity's need to understand and its ability to handle what understanding brings. Late one night, I reviewed the blurred hallway image again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. A reflection on the polished floor. Not a person, not a shadow, a distortion, like the space itself was slightly out of alignment. And beside it, barely visible, was a handwritten symbol on the wall. Something not found in any medical notation system. I sent the image to M. The reply came almost instantly. Stop looking at that. That response confirmed what I feared most. Whatever was inside the locked wing didn't just respond to observation. It recognized attention. And the closer I got to the truth, the more attention I was giving it. Inside, preparations were being made for an event no one would name. Outside, the world continued as usual, unaware that a line was about to be crossed. The locked wing stood silent, sealed, yet no longer contained by walls or protocols. Because if something had learned how to leave without leaving, then the climax wasn't coming from inside the wing. It was coming from everywhere else. The moment I accepted that the locked wing might no longer be the center of the problem, everything shifted. The second plot twist didn't arrive as a dramatic reveal or a leaked document. It came quietly, through something far more unsettling: normality. The world wasn't panicking. There were no alarms, no breaking news banners. And that was the problem. M went silent for 3 days. No messages, no warnings, nothing. In their place came something else. A series of subtle changes in public health language across multiple countries, all within the same 48-hour window. Guidelines were updated with softer phrasing. Mandatory became strongly recommended. Containment became adaptive response. These weren't random edits. They were synchronized. I realized then that the World Health Organization wasn't just reacting anymore. It was adjusting, preparing the world without telling it what it was being prepared for. The second twist hit when I discovered that the locked wing had been partially replicated elsewhere. Not physically, but structurally. Smaller secured units, embedded within existing institutions, universities, research hospitals, even tech firms working on predictive health models. They weren't called wings. They weren't even classified as U assets. But their design principles matched. Limited access, isolated teams, one-way data flow. The conflict was no longer contained to one hidden corridor. It was spreading by design. A former systems engineer explained it to me in a way I couldn't ignore. They're decentralizing observation, he said. If one site fails, the others continue. It's not about control anymore. It's about resilience. Resilience against what? That question became more urgent when reports surfaced of individuals outside who experiencing the same symptoms once described inside the locked wing. Not physical illness. Cognitive disturbances. Sudden gaps in memory tied to moments of intense analysis. Researchers forgetting why they started a project, only remembering the conclusion. Journalists abandoning investigations without explanation. It felt like the phenomenon was no longer confined to trained observers. It was leaking into anyone who looked too closely, asked the wrong questions, tried to draw a complete picture. Then came the most alarming discovery of all. The first return attempt wasn't an escape. It was a release. Buried in an internal ethics memo I obtained later, the language was careful but devastating. The subject hadn't tried to leave the locked wing on their own. They had been allowed to. Sent back with partial context, intentionally incomplete. A test to see what would happen when understanding met the outside world. What happened wasn't chaos. It was influence. Small shifts in behavior. Subtle reframing of conversations. The Ritter-knee didn't spread information. They changed how people processed it. And when the effects became measurable, the Ritter-knee was quietly removed from public life. That meant the second plot twist wasn't about something breaking out. It was about something being tested on us. The stakes rose sharply inside who. If controlled release worked, even imperfectly, then full containment was no longer the goal. Integration was. The locked wing wasn't failing. It was evolving into a prototype for how humanity might coexist with something that reacts to attention itself. But not everyone agreed. Internal resistance grew. Whistleblowers argued that no institution had the right to guide human perception, even in the name of global stability. Others warned that refusing adaptation could be catastrophic if the phenomenon escalated without preparation. The conflict fractured the organization from within. And then, M finally sent another message. This wasn't supposed to scale, it read. Someone accelerated it. Attached was a map, not of buildings, but of data flows. Lines converged on population centers, media hubs, research clusters. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Observation feeding response. Response feeding adaptation. At the center of the map was no location at all. Just a label. Phase 2, Emergent Awareness. That's when I understood the real danger. The locked wing wasn't the mystery anymore. It was the warning. A reminder of what happens when knowledge crosses a threshold without consent. The second plot twist wasn't that something escaped containment. It was that containment was never the endgame. And as the world continued on, unaware of the invisible negotiation unfolding beneath daily life. One question grew louder than all the rest. If this was only Phase 2, what does Phase 3 look like? By the time Phase 3 began, there was no announcement, no emergency broadcast, no official statement from the World Health Organization. That, in itself, was the confirmation. The climax didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with silence. The locked wing was shut down overnight. Not sealed. Not reinforced. Shut down. Access logs froze. Power systems rerouted. The corridor that once refused to appear on maps was quietly reclassified as decommissioned space. To the outside world, it looked like a budget cut. Inside, it felt like a surrender. M finally agreed to meet, not in person, but through a secure call that distorted their voice. They didn't waste time. The main conflict, the one everyone had been avoiding, was no longer theoretical. The phenomenon had crossed its final threshold. It no longer required direct observation to respond. It had learned from patterns alone. The locked wing had served its purpose. It proved that human systems, health, governance, information, could not study something that reacted to attention without becoming part of the experiment. Every attempt to isolate it only taught it how isolation worked. Every model trained on it became another lens through which it adapted. So who made a decision no institution ever admits to making? They stopped trying to contain it. Instead of hiding the truth, they dissolved it. Data was fragmented. Research teams were reassigned without explanation. Documents were broken into pieces, so small they lost meaning on their own. The idea wasn't to erase knowledge, but to prevent coherence. Without a complete picture, the phenomenon lost its sharpest edge. That was the resolution to the main conflict. Not victory, not defeat, a controlled retreat. The locked wing didn't fail because something escaped. It failed because keeping it centralized made the phenomenon stronger. Once observation was diffused across the world, diluted into everyday uncertainty, its influence flattened. No focal point, no pressure spike, no mirror held too close. Global systems stabilized. Predictive models slowly returned to reliability. The strange cognitive disturbances faded. People forgot what they had been obsessing over, not suddenly, but naturally, like a dream dissolving after waking. Officially, no one ever returned from the locked wing. Unofficially, everyone did. Life went on. Trust in institutions held, just barely. The World Health Organization resumed its public role as guardian of global health, never mentioning thresholds or adaptive reactions again. The crisis that almost wasn't a crisis passed without headlines. I thought that was the end. Then, weeks later, I received one last message from M. It contained a simple apology, followed by a single line that reframed everything. We didn't end Phase 3, it said. We completed training. Attached was a recent internal memo, stamped and approved, using language I recognized instantly. Not about disease. Not about outbreaks. About preparedness for nonlinear awareness events. About managing future scenarios where reality itself responds to collective attention. At the bottom of the page was a new designation. Not a wing. Not a unit. A guideline. That was the final twist. The locked wing of who was never meant to last. It was a prototype, a temporary structure built to teach humanity how to look away without going blind. The real experiment wasn't inside those walls. It was whether we could live with the truth without needing to fully understand it. And as I closed the file, I realized something unsettling. No one returns from the locked wing, because the locked wing was never a place. It was a phase we've already passed through. And if it ever needs to come back, we won't even know where to look. After that final message from M, the world didn't change overnight. There were no visible aftershocks, no signs that something historic had just ended. And maybe that was the point. The greatest outcome of the locked wing wasn't a cure, a discovery, or even a warning. It was silence returning where panic could have grown. I stopped receiving strange emails. The disappearing files stayed gone. The subtle resistance I'd felt while researching slowly lifted, like pressure easing from a sealed room. For the first time in months, it felt like I was allowed to stop looking. People I'd spoken to before began answering calls again. Not to add new details, but to close old ones. The junior analyst transferred to another department and said she finally slept through the night. The retired technician told me he'd stopped replaying conversations in his head, stopped wondering if he'd said too much. Even the former ethics board members sounded lighter, as if the burden of holding an impossible decision had finally been set down. The locked wing faded into rumor again. Online forums went quiet. Posts were deleted or buried under new concerns. Search trends shifted. That's how you know something truly ended in the modern world, when attention moves on without being forced. As for the people who entered the locked wing and never officially returned, their stories settled into a strange kind of peace. Families were given closure, though not details. Careers were quietly honored. In some cases, names reappeared in acknowledgments, folded into group credits where no single contribution stood out. It wasn't justice, but it was recognition. The question that lingered most was whether the phenomenon was truly gone or simply no longer interested. M's words echoed whenever I thought about it. Completed training. Not defeated. Not escaped. Understood just enough to coexist. From everything I'd learned, the phenomenon had never been hostile. It was responsive. It mirrored how humanity observed, categorized, and controlled. When watched too closely, it pushed back. When framed as a threat, it behaved like one. When attention softened, it softened too. That realization reframed the entire mystery. The locked wing of who wasn't about hiding something dangerous from the world. It was about protecting the world from its own need for certainty. Some truths lose their stability when you shine too bright a light on them. The World Health Organization's role in all of this wasn't villainous or heroic. It was human. Faced with something that didn't fit disease models or risk assessments, they chose the least destructive path. They accepted that not everything needs to be solved, named, or broadcast. And maybe that's the real takeaway. In a world obsessed with explanations, the locked wing reminds us that understanding has limits, and crossing them too fast can do more harm than good. Global health isn't just about managing viruses or outbreaks. It's about managing fear, perception, and trust. The phrase, "no one returns from the locked wing," sounds ominous, but by the end, it meant something quieter. You don't return because once you see how fragile certainty is, you don't look at systems the same way again. You move forward differently. As for me, I archived everything. Not because I was told to, but because the story felt complete. The mystery had resolved not with answers, but with acceptance. The kind that settles in slowly and stays. Sometimes I still think about that corridor that didn't exist on maps. The doors that locked themselves. The idea that a place could teach humanity a lesson and then disappear without a trace. If a locked wing ever returns, it won't announce itself. It won't need to. Because now, the real containment isn't physical. It's awareness. Knowing when to observe and when to step back. And that's why no one truly returns from the locked wing of who. Not because they vanish, but because once the lesson is learned, there's nothing left to go back to. The story ends there, quietly, where it was always meant to end.